All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and begin our webinar. We are Disability Rights Texas. My name is Veronica Cortez. I'm a community navigator, fit project specialist with Disability Rights Texas. Our webinar today will be focused on housing discrimination and predatory lending. All right, so this will be our roadmap for this evening. We're going to start first discussing Disability Rights Texas and who Disability Rights Texas is. We're going to discuss predatory lending. What is predatory lending? We're going to define the term and talk about that as well. The laws that govern predatory lending are the Fair Housing Act, Equal Credit Opportunity Act, and the Truth in Lending Act. And we'll be focusing a little bit on what each of those laws does in regards to predatory lending practices. We're going to talk about administrative complaints. We're going to share Disability Rights Texas contact information and information about our intake process. And then at the end, I have a QR code for attendees to scan with their telephones and complete our very short, very much appreciated survey about our presentation this evening. So let's begin talking about Disability Rights Texas and who Disability Rights Texas is. So, Disability Rights Texas was formed as part of the National Protection and Advocacy System, the PNA system, and that falls under the purview of the National Disability Rights Network. And what that means is that every state and territory in the United States has a protection and advocacy agency like Disability Rights here in Texas. So, if you travel to another state, there is a PNA agency, a protection and advocacy agency in that state. We are a nonprofit legal firm established in 1977 through federal law. So we are federally mandated, although we're only partially funded federally. Which allows us to keep our nonprofit legal status. Now, our job is to protect and advocate for the rights of Texans with disabilities, to make sure that they are able to participate equally in society. And we do serve Texans of all ages and a wide variety of disabilities, both seen and unseen. So, Disability Rights Texas offers services based on our priorities. Every 2 years, we revamp those priorities. We send out surveys to the disability community and their families, the community, to get their input about those things that are most affecting people with disabilities. And that's what we focus on. So our work is definitely based on those priorities. And among those priorities, our task is to protect the rights of individuals and groups of people with disabilities, both through the courts and justice system. We do have policy specialists that inform policymakers about how issues impact people with disabilities in the state of Texas. DRTX makes sure that they have staff that goes out into the community and educate people with disabilities, the community, their family members about disability rights. And because we are a trusted resource, we do make referrals to programs and services for our clients and people who need those resources. So at Disability Rights Texas, we do have several areas of focus that our issue teams focus on and they work on. Uh, and that includes alternatives to guardianships. Disability Rights believes that if a client with a disability has capacity and has the ability to make their own decisions in healthcare, education, financially, where they want to live, they should have that ability. So, Disability Rights believes that there should be an alternative to guardianship, which removes those rights from a person. So alternatives to guardianships can be anything from powers of attorney to supportive decision-making agreements. Community integration, assuring and helping people with disabilities live within the community and not in institutions. And if they're living in the community, that they have all the available supports that they need in order for them to enjoy being a part of their community. We focus on disaster preparedness and then recovery, making sure that people with disabilities and the community at large is prepared before a disaster ever strikes. And of course, we help people with disabilities in the recovery process, making sure that they can access things like FEMA funds, SBA loans, food benefits, medical benefits, that kind of thing when they find that they can't access it on their own. Our our education team works with early childhood intervention all the way through college and K-12. So we're talking 2 years old to 22. Okay, so we're talking early childhood through college age 22. Our employment team ensures that people with disabilities are able to work with accommodations if necessary to perform their job duties. People with disabilities are a vital part of our employment system. So we want to make sure that people who are looking for those accommodations and making sure people with disabilities aren't being discriminated against in the workplace. Our healthcare team ensures that people with disabilities understand that they have access to healthcare, that they are notified of any changes in their healthcare plan or in their premiums, just making sure that they can access healthcare like if they, any person who is not disabled or has a disability. Our housing team works on discrimination in housing, asking for accommodations for things like asking for inaccessible parking close to their unit, asking for reasonable modifications for the installation of a ramp, and other different examples of reasonable accommodations modifications. Our institutional rights and civil liberties team ensures that people with disabilities in institutions are not illegally restrained, that they are receiving the treatment that they need. And so they are making sure that people in institutions are being treated with dignity and respect as people with disabilities. Our transportation team works to ensure the rights of people with disabilities aren't violated in public transportation, making sure that that public transportation and paratransit is accessible for people with disabilities. Our voting team ensures that people with disabilities are able to exercise their right to vote, that when they go to a polling place that they are not turned away simply because they have a disability. We do have an 800 voting hotline that is available during election season to make sure that polling places are accessible to people with disabilities. All right, so let's get into predatory lending. Excuse me. So what exactly is predatory lending? Well, predatory lending involves deceptive or exploitative practices by lenders, often targeting people with limited financial resources or may find themselves in vulnerable situations. And this disproportionately impacts people with disabilities because oftentimes people with disabilities are on a fixed income and often find themselves in vulnerable situations. So what's the problem with predatory lending? Why are we having this training at all? Well, predatory lending leads to financial hardship and housing instability. Oftentimes with predatory lending practices, people are exhausted of their financial resources. And that can lead to housing instability. That person or that family may end up homeless or unhoused, and that's that housing instability that can come from those predatory lending practices. So the ins and outs of this webinar is that you are aware of your rights and that you learn how to take action if you find that you or someone you know is a victim of predatory lending practices. So, what are some common signs of predatory lending? Well, these are some things that we want you to look out for that are often signs of predatory lending. Things like high interest rates. So we want you to look out for any loan terms with excessive interest rates that often exceed what typical market rates are. Now, this is accounting for people with not so perfect credit. We often know that that when offered a loan, people with not so perfect credit often find themselves with higher interest rates. We're talking beyond that. So if we are including people with a not so good credit in this, and we're saying in the current market that, annual percentage rates are anywhere from, let's say 7%, to 17% for people who don't have good credit or not so good credit. And that's just an example. We have to look at the current numbers to find out what the actual numbers are. That's just an example. We're talking if that's what the market is sustaining right now for lending as far as, credit is concerned and annual percentage rates, we're talking things above that and that far exceed that. We're talking 35% interest rates. So that's an exorbitant interest rate that we would want to watch out for. That could be a sign of predatory lending. Okay. So those far exceed that typical market rate. So look for hidden fees. Be careful, be careful, be careful to not overlook any undisclosed, or any terms that allude to undisclosed fees that can increase significantly the overall cost of your loan. So if there are no fees that are in your contract, but then end up in, what the schedule of payments is, then you've got to make sure that you look for those hidden fees up front. And then, of course, look for any unreasonable terms. We want to avoid loans with terms that are confusing, restrictive, or maybe subject to change without clear communication or notification on your part. So we want to avoid those terms that we don't understand. And it's important that we don't agree to things that we find confusing or we may find constrictive. And especially those items in any loan agreement that make it easier for the lender to change the terms of the loan without notifying you in a clear manner. Okay, so those are signs of predatory lending, and it's important to watch out for them. So, what are the laws that govern predatory lending? Well, the Fair Housing Act, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, or ECOA, and the Truth in Lending Act, or TILA. Excuse me. So, under the Fair Housing Act, it's prohibited to discriminate in any housing related transaction based on the seven protected classes, which are race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, or disability. Under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, or ECOA, that makes it forbids credit discrimination based on race, color, religion, national origin, sex, marital status, age, or whether or not the applicant is receiving public assistance. So there's some overlap in the protections between the Fair Housing Act and ECOA. ECOA does add marital status instead of familial status. It does add age and whether or not you're receiving public assistance. Notice disability is not in the ECOA, but the Fair Housing Act does offer that protection. Now, in the Truth in Lending Act, and this is regardless of a protected class or other class designation, it requires that for anyone applying for any kind of loan to buy a property, it requires that there is clear and transparent disclosure of the terms of the loan. That includes things like annual percentage rates, a schedule of fees. Okay, they've got to be clear under TILA. There can't be any undisclosed fees. There can't be any hidden fees under the Truth in Lending Act. And your repayment schedule on the loan has to be clear and transparent. Those terms, clear and transparent in any term of your loan agreement. So make sure we remember that the Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act forbids credit discrimination, and the Truth in Lending Act requires clear and transparent disclosure. So, furthermore, it's important that we educate ourselves. Okay, when we are applying for a home loan, or we are looking to purchase a property. We have to understand the terms and conditions of any loan before we ever sign it. I encourage you, disability rights encourages you to seek professional advice if needed. Seek a professional who will help you understand the terms of the loan that you may not understand, that may be confusing, that may be restrictive. If you don't understand those terms, seek some professional advice so that those terms can be made clear and that you can get advice as to whether or not that loan is suitable for your needs, and is suitable for your financial situation. It's important to comparison shop. Make sure you explore multiple lenders. Don't just sign the first loan that you were offered. Chances are, if you're offered a loan from one lender, other lenders will be in line to offer, similar terms or different terms, better terms, we don't know. But it's important that you explore those multiple lenders and loan options. And really explore them so that you find that loan that is most favorable and offers you the most favorable terms for your financial situation. And if you see that in the terms that you were offered, there's some predatory lending practices that you might suspect, it's important that you report those. And we're going to talk about how to report those. So if you believe that you've encountered any predatory lending, and this is yourself or someone else, you can file a complaint with your local fair housing organization or regulatory agency. And like I said, I'm going to go ahead and discuss that shortly on how to file that complaint. So, who has to comply under the Fair Housing Act? We are Disability Rights Texas, so we're going to focus on the disability aspect of the Fair Housing Act. So, who has to comply with the Fair Housing Act when we are talking about lending or just housing in general? Who has to comply? Well, property owners, property managers, housing that receives federal funds, it's subsidized, it receives low-income tax credits, or some other funding from the federal government. Homeowners associations and condo associations have to comply with the Fair Housing Act. Real estate agents, brokerage service agencies, banks, insurance companies, the list goes on. But there are exceptions. There are always exceptions. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of who doesn't have to comply with the Fair Housing Act. If a multifamily property, apartment complexes, if an apartment complex is built before, or people didn't move in, people moved in before March 13th of 1991, those properties do not have to comply with the Fair Housing Act. It is only properties where people moved in after March 13th, 1991 that have to comply with the Fair Housing Act. Another example is there is a rental property that is being offered, and it is the second home of a person, and they're using it as an income property. Normally, that wouldn't trigger a Fair Housing Act obligation. Now, if that same owner advertises that rental in the newspaper, they hire a real estate agent to offer the property there as a rental. If they advertised on Zillow or housing or some other housing website, then that's going to trigger fair housing obligations to that landlord. Okay, because they've advertised that property for rent. So now they are going to be obligated by the Fair Housing Act. So there are exceptions, but then there are exceptions to those exceptions, is the one I mentioned. Now, under the Fair Housing Act, we have seven protected classes, and that's race, African American, Anglo, or Asian are the three races. And then color, that is very different than race because within each race, there are variations in skin tones. And oftentimes, people are discriminated because they are of darker skin within that same population, within that same race. So, color is different from race in that regard. National origin. Where is this person's origins, ancestral origins? Are they from a Latin country? Are they from a European country? An Asian country? So where a person's lineage originates from is a protected class. Religion. Practicing any religion is protected under the Fair Housing Act. So there cannot be discrimination based on someone's religion or not practice of a religion. There are different religions that may be different from the homeowners or the landlords, and they cannot discriminate based on their religious practices. Sex is discriminating against women, discriminating against men simply because of their gender. Okay. Familial status is whether or not you have children. Okay. And then disability. And disability, it covers both disabilities that are seen and disabilities that are unseen under the Fair Housing Act. So, who is it that is protected via disability under the Fair Housing Act? Well, it's any person that has a physical or a mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. Let me repeat that. Has a physical or mental impairment, a person that has a physical or mental impairment that limits a major life activity. If you use a mobility device, your major life activity that's substantially limited is your ability to walk. If you use a breathing device, you an oxygen machine, you require an inhaler, well, the impairment that substantially limits that activity is that you can't breathe. So any person uh, that is affected by an impairment in their daily life is a person considered a person with a disability. Any person that has a record of such an impairment or disability. Someone may be taking medication. So maybe they're not showing symptoms of their disability because of that medication, but they have a record of having that impairment, regardless. and then any person who's regarded as having such an impairment. Okay, and that is under 42 USC, that's the US code 423602H. Who else gets to be protected via disability under the Fair Housing Act? Someone associated with a person who has a disability. For example, your family members. If you're a parent of a child with a disability, if you are a child who cares for your elderly parents, you are covered under the Fair Housing Act as well. This is I'm going to focus a little bit on this one, on someone with a history of a disability. So I need to note that under the Americans with Disabilities Act, alcoholism is considered a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that's active alcoholism. So that's a person with a disability. So someone who suffers from alcoholism is a person with a disability. Now, a person who is a former substance user, an illegal substance user who successfully completed an addiction recovery program is considered a person with a disability. Now, I have to emphasize that this is someone who is no longer in active addiction. This is someone who's completed an addiction recovery program. They're recovered, they're in recovery. Okay, we're not talking active substance abusers. Okay, we're not talking about someone who's an active who's active in addiction. Okay, we're talking people who are in recovery. And then, of course, someone that a housing provider or any entity with fair housing obligations thinks has a disability. So they're going to be protected under the Fair Housing Act. So, what does the Fair Housing Act prohibit? Well, refusing to sell or rent, refusing to negotiate for the sale or rent of, or otherwise making unavailable or denying a rental unit because of a person's protected class. Okay, or a dwelling. It could be a house, it could be a townhome, it could be a condo, it could be a rental unit, a rental house. So refusing to negotiate is prohibited. Making unavailable, denying that rental or that dwelling is prohibited. Okay, simply because they're of that protected class, that list of protected classes that I just mentioned. It also prohibits setting different terms, different conditions, privileges for sale or rental of a dwelling. Okay, and I've got to note that the first bullet point is the U.S. Code 42, Section 3604A. 3604B is the one for setting different terms, conditions, or privileges. We're talking about different rental terms. Okay, you cannot ask a person with a disability who's part of that protected class to give you twice the deposit for a rental because you're afraid that their mobility device is going to tear up the carpet. You can't do that. Setting different conditions. Well, you can't use the a clubhouse or the community pool is inaccessible for you. Privileges. No, you can't use the clubhouse or the pool. Okay, and that's 3604B of the US Code 42. So it's also prohibited under the Fair Housing Act to make ads, statements, or notices that might show a preference or a limitation or some kind of discrimination in the sale or rental of a dwelling. So that means we cannot put an advertisement in the newspaper that says no families or single men only or it's fill in the blank. That's prohibited under the Fair Housing Act to make those kinds of ads or statements. So what happens next? You feel that you or someone have been a victim of predatory lending. You feel that your rights have been violated. What can you do? What recourse do we have? Well, we can file an administrative complaint, and I'm going to show you what it is that they are, where and how to file. And we have to note that when filing an administrative complaint is that's going to toll a 1 year statute of limitations. You have 1 year from the last day of discrimination to file an administrative complaint. Excuse me. The other avenue that we have is to file a lawsuit in court, and that is that we have the ability to, to hire an attorney or find a pro bono attorney, searching for that, and having them file a lawsuit on your behalf. And of course, when we file a lawsuit under this type of discrimination, that's going to toll a 2 year statute of limitation. And then, of course, that begins from the last date of discrimination. Now, it is important to note that an administrative complaint and a lawsuit can be filed simultaneously at the same time. What you don't have to wait for the administrative complaint to be finalized before you can file a lawsuit. You can do it at the same time. The statute of limitations, however, for each type of complaint or lawsuit, that's going to have their statute of limitations that begins. So, what are administrative complaints? Well, administrative complaints are a recourse for any violation of a person's rights through the legislative branch instead of the judicial branch. And that's under U.S. Code 42, again, 3610. Now, once you file that complaint, an investigating agency is going to conduct an investigation on your claim. They will most likely ask for more information, doctor's notes, supporting documents, things like that. Any witness contact information, any statements relating to that, that may have information relating to that matter. So here's a tip from us to you. When filing an administrative complaint, it's important to watch out for deadlines because you will be asked to submit documents within a certain time frame. Now, although it's possible that an extension can be asked for, that's going to prolong the complaint in the investigation process. So we do recommend that those deadlines are adhered to when they are asking you for any documentation. So, conciliations and the administrative complaint. So, the investigating agency is going to attempt to conciliate the matter. And to conciliate the matter simply means to work with the parties to come to a solution. Okay. Now, if there is no meeting of the minds, they don't come up with a conciliation. The investigating agency has to make a determination to see if there's enough evidence to move forward and charge the case, or that there's not enough evidence and they're going to dismiss the matter. So if they find that there's enough evidence, they're going to charge the case. They're going to take the case on. If there's not enough evidence, they're going to say that there is no case. So they're going to dismiss it. Of course, this doesn't stop you from filing a lawsuit with a private attorney that is going to file that lawsuit on your behalf. So, where do you file these administrative complaints? Well, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, in Texas, Texas Workforce Commission, Civil Rights Division, and then local city fair housing assistance programs throughout the state of Texas. So, when I file an administrative complaint with HUD, the Fair Housing Act gives HUD the authority to delegate these investigations, these claims, to state and local governments is if they have substantially similar laws or ordinances to the Fair Housing Act. And in Texas, Texas Workforce Commission Civil Rights Division has been given that authority. And of course, there are other local governments throughout the state of Texas that also are given that authority by HUD. And when HUD delegates these cases for investigation, the investigating agencies are getting paid through HUD for conciliating these cases or for making any kind of finding. And of course, it's important to remind you that filing an administrative complaint will toll the statute of limitations of 1 year. All right. So, excuse me. So once I have my complaint, I've been aggrieved. My rights have been violated. I can file my administrative complaint with HUD online at hud.gov/program_offices/fair_equal_op/online-complaint. Uh, if you find that you cannot access or the online complaint process with HUD's website, even you have got a disability, you can submit it in other ways if needed because of that disability. And one way is via phone. If you are a person with a disability and want to file a complaint with HUD, you can call them at 800-669-9777. If you or someone who wants to file a housing complaint with HUD and are deaf or hard of hearing, there is a TTY number at 817-978-5595. So in Texas, we can file administrative complaints with Texas Workforce Commission Civil Rights Division. And we can do that via email, online, and via phone. Their email is on this link, and there is a site at the Texas Workforce Commission Civil Rights Division Housing Complaint Intake. There's a link. There's also a link for their online administrative complaint form at their website to file a housing complaint. You can, in Texas, contact them at 512-463-2642, or for Texas residents, 888-452-8778 is their 888 toll-free number. If you are assisting someone with their administrative complaint, whether you're representing them or you're assisting them, here's another tip. Make sure that the letter, that the client submits a letter to Texas Workforce Commissions that you're either representing them, you're a contact, you have information as or a witness. And that way, Texas Workforce Commission Civil Rights Division will be apprised of your involvement. You can also file an administrative complaint with TWC via fax or mail. Their fax number is 512-463-2643. Or you can use our wonderful U.S. Postal Service and mail your complaint form to Texas Workforce Commission Civil Rights Division at 101 East 15th Street, Austin, Texas, zip code 78778. Now, here is our contact information, and we're going to talk about a little bit about our intake process at Disability Rights Texas. So you want to take one of these cases, you want to file an administrative complaint, either for yourself or on behalf of someone, but you need guidance. Reach out to Disability Rights Texas. Our intake line is available Monday through Thursday from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. So that number would be 1-800-252-9108. We also do have a sign language video phone with intake staff that is fluent in ASL, and they can be reached at 1-866-362-2851. We do have an additional Purple 2 video phone for people in need of a sign language assistance, and that number is 512-271-9391. Disability Rights Texas also has an online intake form available at intake.dr.texas. For now, that intake form is available in English only. So if you need language assistance of any kind, please reach out to our intake phone line. Again, that's available from Monday through Thursday from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Um, all right. And how did we do? If you would please take our survey, let us know how we do. I'm going to leave this on the screen for about another minute or so that they can be scanned. And that is the end of our presentation today. Thank you so much for joining our webinar on housing rights as it pertains to predatory lending and what to look for so that we are not victims of predatory lending. So let us know how we did by taking the survey. The survey only takes a few minutes. Please let us know what you took away from this presentation, what we can do to make our presentation better. Because we do read those and we do use your suggestions in improving our presentations here at Disability Rights Texas. Um, all right, so I'm going to move on from the QR code. And we would like to thank the Department of Housing and Urban Development because the work that was provided for this publication was supported by funding under a grant under HUD. So our findings are dedicated and our work is dedicated to the general public. Um, Disability Rights Texas are solely responsible for the statements and the interpretations contained in this publications. And those interpretations do not necessarily reflect the views of the federal government. Again, thank you so much for joining me today for our webinar on your rights under your rights when it comes to predatory lending and housing discrimination. Thank you so much again. This has been Veronica Cortez, Community Navigator FIT Project Specialist with Disability Rights Texas. Thank you so much for joining our call today. Thank you.